us to our final speaker for the afternoon. We will have the panel after this. However, Michael Hampton from Synapse will be our last single presenter today. And Michael basically has been an advocate in disability services since 2008. So he has a great knowledge of the sorts of issues facing people with both traumatic brain injury but also acquired brain injury. And we were particularly asked last year to target how to access the NDIS, and I know you're going to really enjoy this next presentation because it's actually really well put together. So I'd like to welcome Michael Hampton to the podium and ask you to welcome him, please.
Clickers there, yeah. Thanks everybody. I didn't realise I have to follow a dance session. It's a very hard act to follow, but I'll try and live up to the expectations of the dance technique that's just been shown by everybody. So my name's Michael Hampton. I've been a disability advocate, as Michelle said, since about 2008. Prior to that, I practiced law for many years in various areas. And specifically, I've been with Synapse, who are formerly the Brain Injury Association of New South Wales, since 2012. I'm a bit quiet, am I? I'll talk up. If anybody can't hear me, let me know. And if I'm going too quickly, let me know as well. I'm more than happy to slow down. We predominantly provide advocacy to people with a brain injury, both acquired and traumatic, and neurocognitive disorders, and certainly those who have survived stroke. Since 2013, we've been funded by the federal government, separate to the NDIS, to provide advocacy services for NDIS appeals and reviews, and have been involved in the NDIS since 2013, in the rollout stages in Newcastle when we opened an office up there to gather as much knowledge as possible. So what I'm here today to try and give some assistance is to help people who want to access the NDIS. And there's a couple of caveats to this today. A lot of things I'm going to talk about, I think, necessarily are for those people who have survived stroke who are on the cusp of the functional impairments required to access the NDIS. I think it's probably best that I focus on those areas than actually if there's been far more catastrophic consequences of stroke where access is possibly more straightforward. The other thing I sort of wanted to start with as well was a little bit of positive feedback about the NDIS. I've been around disability for long enough to understand that prior to the NDIS, getting supports if you had a disability was a bit of a lottery and very, very difficult. As an advocate, I only tend to hear the bad stories, and I think as members of the public, we only tend to read bad stories in the press about the NDIS as well. And I think it's important to remember that the NDIS has been quite a revolutionary scheme, and for a vast majority of people who are participants in the NDIS, their quality of life has improved. So I think that's something we should all remember, because there will be trials and tribulations during the NDIS, but I think it's been a very positive thing for disability. Sorry. So we look at the legislative requirements of access to the NDIS. The NDIS is governed by an act that is the National Disability Insurance Act of 2013, which is when the scheme started. And there are a few requirements in the Act for access to the NDIS. The first one's an age requirement, and you must make an application to enter the NDIS as a participant before you turn 65. Now, that can be the day before you turn 65, and once that access request is made, then it allows you, if there is the need for further reviews or for appeals, to continue with that access request after the age of 65. But the access request must be done prior to 65. The second requirement is under section 23, and that's that you must be a resident of Australia, and you either must be an Australian citizen or a holder of a permanent visa or a holder of a special protected visa, which is one of those visas that specifically relates to people from New Zealand from about 1983 till about 1997. I'm not going to dwell too much on these areas. These are the very basic sort of hurdles that you need to get over for the first in the access application. We then get to section 24. Section 24 is the major area that people have difficulties with when they're accessing the NDIS. The first, and you must tick each of these areas. So 24 are sections A to E, and you must qualify under each of those sections. So 24A is the specific disability area, and you don't need to qualify under each of these areas, just one of these is fine. And I would think that for those who are a stroke survivor, quite often they could qualify under cognitive, neurological, sensory or physical. Doesn't need to be all of those, it can be any one of those. The second area is section 24B, which is all about the permanency of the impairment. Now the best evidence, and I'll talk about best evidence a few times today, for permanency tends to come from your treating specialist. So either that being your neurologist or a rehabilitation specialist on the ward that you're in hospital. And they are the people who will give the best evidence for the NDIS in relation to permanency. There's another slide on permanency in a minute as well, because it's very important, and I think it's good we come back to that, and I'll give you a few more suggestions in relation to that as well. So I left this one in, and this is from a previous talk that I've given, but I think it's good to remember that sometimes brain injury and stroke, it can be a bit of an invisible disability at times, and that it's very important to have your treating specialists identify those areas that might be a problem for you. The third section is 24C, and these are what's known as the domains of functional capacity, and section 24C requires there to be what's termed substantially reduced functional capacity. Now that's not really defined anywhere else in this particular act or in any of the rules, but it breaks it down into 6 domains: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care and self-management. It's sufficient to get access to the NDIS by qualifying in any one of these domains. It's not necessary for you to tick more than one box in this area, so I would always recommend to someone who's seeking access to the NDIS, when they're looking at these domains, to talk to their treating specialists or to their allied health team and look at the area that they have the most difficulty with and the area that they fit best into these particular domains. I'll go through each of these domains specifically. The fourth and the fifth sections 24D and E, I tend to skip over quite quickly because it's not, I've never seen anybody rejected specifically on section 24D or Section 24E. So 24D being that the impairments affect a person's capacity for social economic participation, and 24E that the person's likely to need lifetime support from the NDIS. Now, the reason I say I'll skip over those is because if you get a disability, it's shown to be permanent and you're shown to have substantial functional impairment, then you'll always end up having qualifying under sections 24D and E. Sometimes you'll see declinations of access based on permanency being 24B, and they'll often say under sections 24B and E in the fact that it's not requiring supports for life. So I said earlier I'd come back to some things that have always been difficult in the NDIS, and permanency is the one that I want to come back to initially, which is section 24B. And I know there's probably a lot of medical professionals in the room and treaters, and often I read reports that are very well intentioned in that Michael has suffered a stroke, he has a loss of use of his right arm in relation to it. So we've got the first bit being there's a disability, a specific disability, a bit functional in 24C, but then the doctor might say, and he's having ongoing treatment with the view to increasing his capacity in that area. That tends to then allow the NDIA to suggest that possibly it's not a permanent disability. So what I would suggest that you talk to your doctors about is just being very frank about their diagnosis in letters to the NDIS and say this is a permanent disability, all treatment has been completed, there will be no improvement, full stop. And if you can do that, then the permanency section 24B is covered very quickly and very accurately. So I said I'd come back to the domains. So, as I said earlier, we talk about best evidence. Best evidence for each of the domains tends not to come from your treating doctors, but more often than not from the various allied health professionals you would have come across either in the hospitals or in the community treatment teams, being your occupational therapists, your speech pathologists, your physiotherapists, or your neuropsychologists. They are the people who I would be seeking to get evidence from and to complete the access request form in relation to the questions about your reduced functional capacity, not your treating doctors. Treating doctors, and more often not, because of the way that they're trained, give very technical responses to questions. When we're not really after technical responses in this area, we're actually after how it affects you on a day-to-day basis. So communication is the first domain, and that's all about your ability to understand language and express needs, and with stroke survivors that can often be in relation to your receptive speech or expressive speech, word finding ability, aphasia, dysphagia. Once again, that evidence in relation to that is best given by your speech pathologist if you've have a speech pathologist in the team that's been treating you. Second domain is then social interaction, and this is about making and keeping friends, relationships, both familiar and general relationships within the community, behaviour, and coping with feelings and emotions, so anxiety and depression. This is an area that can be a prompt if the disability that you've suffered causes some changes to your behaviour, increases sometimes your anger or your the way you react to things and things like that. And quite often there can be some aggression or an inability to communicate with people in a social setting as well. So if the first domain was about communication, that can also flow into the second domain of social interaction as well. And it's a prompt here. The evidence often in the social interaction can be taken from your neuropsychologist. So a neuropsychologist is someone who looks at what the strengths and the weaknesses are after the stroke or after an acquired brain injury, and can assist with identifying those and providing evidence to the NDIA in relation to that. The next domain is mobility, and I've got a few slides on mobility. It's one of those areas that can be an easy access entry point, depending on your level of mobility. And this is all about, once again, your daily living and how you do things on a day-to-day basis. How you get in and out of bed. Can you get in and out of bed? Do you require someone to help? Now, I don't know if anybody's seen the access request form, but it often has, or it does have some tick boxes on it. It sort of says requires assistance, independent, and your treating professional can tick those boxes. And I've got a note to say this again a little bit later. Ticking the boxes itself is not sufficient. It actually needs to be fleshed out as to what that looks like. So if I take, for example, getting out of bed, Michael requires the assistance of one other to be lifted from the bed to a standing position. So it needs to be a little more than just requires the assistance of others. It needs to be a description of what that actually looks like. Again, there's some specific mentions both in the Act and in the rules that things like grab rails, walking sticks, glasses are not equipment that is of sufficient gravity within the view of the NDIA and in the view of the NDIS legislation to allow automatic access. So if you have an occupational therapist, and once again they're the best evidence people to provide the report for this domain, then you're looking at the various mobility aids that you might require. Now that might be orthotics, it might be an AFO, it might be a second skin, it might be major modifications that are required to your bathroom to make it accessible, to remove trip hazards, things like that. It's not just simply putting a rail next to a toilet or putting a rail in the shower itself. It needs to be a little more significant than that. It needs to be something that requires prescription by an allied health professional, most likely an occupational therapist. I've put in there case law driving. There's a little prompt for me. So, as I said, that we provide some support for appeals in the AAT, and there was a case by the name of Madeline which has caused a lot of difficulties in the domain of mobility. The applicant in that matter was able to drive and walk very, very slowly to the car and walk very, very slowly from the car to the various places she needed to get to. Unfortunately, although her mobility was significantly impaired in our view, the tribunal found that because she was able to drive and because she was able to do things at a slow pace but able to do them, that she didn't qualify for access to the NDIS for driving, for mobility. So if you're able to drive and continue to drive, then it's possibly, your mobility area is possibly not the domain that you would be seeking access under. 2 minutes? I'll go a little bit quicker. So the next domain is learning, so that's understanding, remembering information, so it's memory issues specifically. And again, your best evidence there comes from your neuropsychologist. The next domain is self-care. And this is, again, all about your day-to-day living. And I've put some examples there, and they're examples that are given in the access request form. Things like showering, and again, it's not as simple to say, I need assistance to shower. It would be something like, I can't wash my feet, I can't wash my hair. Those sort of specific details about how self-care is affected by your disability. Again, saying that it takes you longer to do something is probably not going to be enough to get you in access to the NDIS in this domain. You've got to be able to not do it and or require assistance. And again, that assistance needs to be specifically talked about when you talk to your occupational therapist as to what that looks like for you. I'll just a little prompt there for me as well of eating. So when you think about eating, it's not actually just the physical aspect of putting food into your mouth. It's all of those steps that it takes to get to sit down to eat. So whether it's to go shopping to get the food preparation, what food preparation looks like for you. Can you cut up hard things? Can you remember what to buy from the shop? Things like that. The final domain is what's known as self-management, and that's about your day-to-day decisions, your ability to handle money, your ability to solve problems. Sometimes the executive functioning, that would be called with brain injury, and some of the examples that you might have of that if you've required to get a trustee or one of your family members to help you with your financial dealings on a day-to-day basis. You might want to talk about how you make decisions. You know, you might need someone to support you to make decisions and what that looks like, whether you sit down and have a list of pros and cons, as I call it, the good things about a decision, the bad things about a decision. And I think medication as well, whether you need prompts to take your medication, whether you're forgetful in relation to those things. Just finally, before I open it up for questions, and I'm very happy to take as many questions as we've got time for, we at Synapse will certainly help you with reviews and appeals. And just going back to what I started with the NDIS and the changes and the positives, I've always seen the fact that you can appeal a decision as a great step forward in relation to disability and disability funding. That was never the situation in the past. We have the ability now to put things before the tribunal, shape the way the NDIS looks, and tailor matters really individually to your particular needs. So in summary overall, this is access to the NDIS is all about getting the best evidence that's available, and who can give that best evidence. Disability permanency, your treating doctors, your neurologists, your rehabilitation specialists. Substantial functional reduced or substantially reduced functional capacity, your allied health professionals, be it your occupational therapist, speech pathologist, physiotherapist, neuropsychologist.
plenty of time for questions because I knew you'd need them. So we've spent a lot of times within the association saying to doctors and nurses and educating doctors and nurses about the fact that people will recover from stroke. And that's, I guess, where we run into problems with the NDIS really, because you'll need to start, I guess, right from that word go, when people are in hospital, would you not, to start getting your treating doctors and your allied health team at that point to start looking at your capacity long term and start providing the information you need. Would that be correct?
That's definitely correct. And I think I touched on it earlier in relation to sort of doctors in your treating team having their whole life they're trained to sort of continue the recovery phase, and we all know that the recovery phase for lots of things goes over many years. But I think we need to be really blunt with your treating professionals, sort of saying we need evidence that says how I am now is how I'm going to be for a long time into the future, and nothing further than that. And I've got, on the next page, I just had 2 words that were written down as well, which touch on this. Get your doctors to use the term maintenance, not rehabilitation, not recovery. Maintain your current functional capacity, not rehabilitate it, not recover it. So maintenance, maintenance, maintenance.
Excellent. Can I open it up to the floor now and for those online to see if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask? Is there anyone in the room who'd like to ask a question? I think one of the things that Michael has done very well is has basically covered that permanent issue very well, because it's a very difficult one, I think, for our health professionals to basically indicate, because they don't want it to be permanent as much as you don't want it to be permanent. So we'll open it up for a question now. Simon, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Mine's more of a comment than a question. I'm one of the lucky people, and mine's a positive story about the NDIS. I'm buggered if I know where I'd be without it. I wouldn't be here now, today. I have a carer, accommodation and transport. I've got a fantastic package. And it's between Medicare and NDIS, we live in the best country in the world.
Thanks, Simon.
Do I have another question? We've got plenty of time. I allowed plenty of time for this because I knew this was a really important topic for people. Very specific questions, if you have one particularly for you. Lee, you have a question? I shall move you over to there.
Mine's not really a question. Mine is, the NDIS wasn't in very long and Tom was about to be 65. We had our GP fill out the form, but Tom always went to his GP and said, look what I can do, look what I can do. And we got knocked back because it was the exact opposite than what you're saying we should have done. It was all, he has improved so much and whatever. And he had his birthday, his 65th, just after that. And so we've lost out. And if it had been filled out the way you mentioned, we would have got it. And yeah, I wish we had that knowledge then. So good on you for letting other people know. So thank you.
Yeah, GPs are overworked, underpaid at the end of the day, and I think it's required to have a vast amount of information and knowledge about it, which is why I've talked specifically about your best evidence. It's not unusual for people with a brain injury and those who have suffered a stroke to understate what their disability is. And I suppose all I can suggest is that you make sure that the doctors are aware of actually what the day-to-day looks like at home. Sometimes it's not pretty, sometimes it's really difficult to say, but that's the time to say it, and hopefully you're comfortable with the people who have been supporting you at that time to make those statements.
another question, because often with stroke survivors, and particularly those in the younger age group, which is what we're talking about really, they don't have a GP until they've had a stroke, and that becomes a real issue as well. So they don't have, other than the treating doctors within the stroke units and the rehab units, they often don't have people who know them very well. And there's a trick, isn't there, to getting a good GP interview. That's my trick.
Well, there certainly is a trick to it. You know, I think you can ask Synapse, who have an information line. I'm sure the Stroke Association as well has a similar sort of service available as to GPs in your area that might have some understanding of various things. I'm looking particularly here at Royal Rehab's table as well. They've got as most hospitals do, they have a panel of social workers with them as well that can certainly assist you to fill out the access request form and get the appropriate treating specialists or allied health teams within the hospital system to set you up in that right direction as well.
Can I ask a question? You might not be able to answer mine, but going back to where you said we can't say ongoing treatment, I'm one of those healthcare professionals. We are encouraged to write those in the acute phase, so they might only be a week or two post their stroke. Yep. We can't write that they're not having ongoing treatment, so how do we get around that?
Look, I would suggest you don't make the application in the week or two after the stroke.
But we don't get that option anymore.
It's difficult because we have that problem as well with Centrelink. You know, because you say the same thing with Centrelink, and someone who obviously would qualify for a disability pension misses out because there's that there and it's going on. I don't have the best answer apart from maybe writing two reports. Having one that the person can use specifically for access or for their Centrelink access, and one specifically that then goes to various treating GPs or other allied health professionals who you are then giving direction as to what you've done and what you hope to achieve if certain things are carried out.
And I guess that's a flaw too in the NDIS system, isn't it? And maybe as an advocacy organisation we need to start addressing that as well. Because while certainly at the acute phase of stroke you couldn't say that treatment wasn't ongoing, and even in rehab sometimes you can't say that either. But there has to be a way, because particularly when you've got people who are significantly have had a significant stroke and need to go into a supported accommodation area, without the NDIS that becomes much more difficult, particularly if they can't go home. And we don't want our younger stroke going into aged care facilities. We want them in the right place, such as Simon was talking to me about earlier, where they get excellent care, but they're also in the company of younger people and do the same things that younger people do, whether that is go to the football, whether that's go to the movies, or whatever it is. But we want them where they're with younger people whose interests are similar. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. I think, and this is something that possibly needs to be addressed in the hospital system itself as well. These reports and these notes need to be written at the discharge stage more than at the ongoing treatment stage or even the transfer to community teams stage. I think I probably, as I said earlier, I sort of address this more to those people who are on the cusp. I think one of the great things we've seen from the NDIS is the prevalence now of supported accommodation, or independent accommodation, which is more to the point, and the ability for people to move into that. I've not come across in my appeals work too many people who have not got access who would be transitioning into that style of support. Certainly the NDIS now has a particularly good young persons or YIPI-RAC outreach team as well, who are targeting those people with brain injuries or stroke survivors who still languish in aged care facilities. And I think that if there's anybody here who knows of people who are still in that situation, certainly reach out to ourselves or to Michelle, I would imagine, and we can put you into contact with various people in relation to that.
One more question?
We've got a question online. So in my experience, we have found it hard for the NDIS to understand the difficulties of aphasia. Do you have any suggestions to help this?
Yeah. Have your speech pathologist explain it in simple terms, not in technical terms. What it looks like to you, how it affects your communication on a daily basis, all of those things. There was one report that I had that I received this morning actually, where a well-intentioned physiotherapist talked about STSs and 10 WMTs and it's an L but it could be an I, WS, all of these little shorthand terms, sit to stand I think, WS walk with stick, I, it's an I, was independent, could have been an L. So it's talk about the things and how it affects you day to day. So, as I said, it's tick the box, requires assistance, requires technology, etc. But then say what it is you require and how you need that to communicate.
All right, we might be running out of time there now. So, really, I'd like to personally thank Michael. It is excellent to have somebody who can come along and explain the NDIS in terms that we can understand. It's a very complicated process and a lot of our members have struggled for many years to get access to it. So it's tremendous that you've been able to come along today and put it in terms that we understand and to give us some tips and techniques to take back to our healthcare professionals to ensure that we get that right the first time round. And we don't need your services in terms of appeal, while they're fabulous at there. But again, a lot of our members have been knocked back, so there may be some of you out there who have been knocked back, so make use of the program that's operating at Synapse to try again. It's so important to get the quality of services you need to maintain your level. It's essential that you do that. So thank you very much again.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.